Welcome! There are several reasons why I wanted to make this video. First of all, ever since I finished the story and later completed the game 100%, I was convinced that I didn't want to talk about this world's lore. There are a lot of reasons for that, but that's not really the point. What's undeniable is that Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a game that will be remembered for the impact it had during a time when the industry, and especially big budget productions, has been going through a serious crisis. It showed that pure passion can still resonate with players and affect them on a deep level, despite the many technical rough edges and low budget limitations that frankly are pretty easy to spot. But that's not really the point. The point is that the game is built with such care and attention to detail that those issues naturally fade into background, and honestly this happens quite often in the industry. Many games that are considered all-time masterpieces have some very serious flaws, even when judged by the standards of their own release period. So why am I making this video? First of all, because I love Expedition, and because of that it only feels fair to make a video where I talk about the things I didn't enjoy as much. I simply want to discuss them. The truth is that my opinion and my feelings about the game's narrative and themes changed over time. I went from feeling mostly detached from the characters and the world to being generally affected by the themes the game explores, after taking some time to process them and think about them more carefully. And that shift made me develop a suspicion about the way the story is presented and explained. A suspicion that, at this point, has become a proper opinion regarding some aspects of the game's storytelling. To put it simply, I was disappointed by Act 3. In many ways I think it's the weakest part of the game, mainly for narrative reasons but also for simple gameplay reasons. Simple. Now, before going any further, I wanted to make it clear that Act 3 is still incredible when it comes to direction and presentation, just like the rest of the game. Since I think the game's strengths and overall quality are already obvious to everyone, I'd rather focus on the areas that didn't fully convince me and that I believe could have been handled better. Then, in the second part of the video, I want to talk about the aspects of the game that impressed me the most and that I'm simply excited to discuss. So, let's move on and start with the biggest section of this analysis. It's also going to be the hardest one to explain because it lays the foundation for everything else. The final message carried by the two endings never really convinced me. Having a good ending and a bad ending, the way they are presented from a narrative point of view, reflects how Act 3 is written with a different level of depth compared to the rest of the game. And pay attention, I'm not talking about what happens in the plots, because I actually like both outcomes. I'm talking about how they are shown to the player as the result of a choice at a crossroads, especially since this crossroads is not the result of several choices made over time, but of a single one. That the authors told a good ending and a bad ending is not something I am saying, it is the game itself that says it, even though the authors later confirmed that this was not their intention. Basically, what I want to demonstrate is that, from an exposition point of view, there are some questionable choices in the final section, because they go against the goals that I believe the authors actually cared about, and on which they built the whole plots and characters. Pillars that, if removed, would make half of the world building feel trivial and flat. So, let us start from the root. I don't know whether it's the game's fault or my fault, but the tragedy told here is actually much more complex than it first seemed to me right after I finished the game. It's not just about Aline's grief and Versoul's death. There are some key aspects involving all the characters that, in my opinion, are not very clear or are not explored enough. Among these, the biggest one is how the painted world is presented and therefore how the game handles the theme of destroying Lumiere with all the implications that come with it. The other theme I will go into later is the protagonist and her need to stay inside the canvas. And the reason I keep focusing on this is that I like these themes. I like how they harmonize with the plot and into each character's role. I like them because they give weight to what the protagonists do, and they also give a real meaning to what is happening. So, what did I not like? I didn't like the fact that the exposition isn't capable of expanding these themes as they should, and in a way it leaves them hanging, wasting some very interesting potential. I'm not saying it would have been easy to do it properly and get really strong results. I'm only saying that I see a missed opportunity here and a challenge that, in the end, the authors didn't fully choose to take on.
Child, do you think I want to? After all the sorrows we've endured, do you really think that I want to destroy this last piece of his soul?
Don't.
Life keeps forcing cruel choices. We do what we must.
Let's start with the biggest sore spot. The thing that bothered me the most about Act 3's entire presentation is the way the concept of a word within a word was handled. I'm starting here because pretty much every other issue is connected to it. To put it simply, when experiencing the final section of the game, I see a failure to give enough weight and substance to the survival of a world that the player has personally spent the entire game fighting for. The fire that drove the protagonist to desperately search for a solution to the gommage is extinguished by an Act 3 that ends up treating that conflict as secondary, and that shift has some very concrete consequences. The moment the veil is lifted and it's revealed that everything the protagonists have been risking their lives for was, let's say, not exactly real, is hardly a groundbreaking narrative twist, but it works brilliantly up until the beginning of Act 3. The Pentress is no longer the point, the gommage is no longer the point, the decay of an entire universe is no longer the point, the destruction of Lumiere is no longer the point, but the problem is that this is still the point. As the characters approach the question of destroying the canvas, the conflict becomes exclusively about choosing between saving the Sun family or saving versus memory. And while that conflict is emotionally engaging and genuinely interesting, is it really enough to fully express the potential of this world building? Everything revolves around the soul of a lost son and a mother who refuses under any circumstances to let go of a piece of her life. On the other side you have Renoir, the real goat who, precisely because of how much he loves his family, is willing to sacrifice the memory of his son. It's all very moving, but we're not talking about a simple painting here. We're talking about an entire world. This is where Expedition, in my opinion, fails to capitalize on its own themes. It goes past them instead of exploring them. There is, in fact, on one side the broader moral dilemma that naturally comes with the Matrix problem, and then on the other side there's the clash between the emotional and human needs of a family and the needs of a world that may or may not have the right to exist. This was the Too Long Didn't Read. Now let's actually talk about it. First, I want to make clear why I think the exposition fails on this front, and honestly, because I was afraid I might be talking complete nonsense, I went back and rewatched all of Act 3 cutscenes one more time, hoping they would disprove my criticism. And I got so angry, because the presentation of the game's final stretch constantly tries to heighten a family drama, which is perfectly legitimate, by the way, but it does so by keeping every major confrontation at a very surface level emotional register. The discussions almost never dig into the heart of the issue, they always stay on the surface, they never reach the essence of what is actually being discussed. If I wanted to exaggerate, I'd say the protagonists suddenly become morons. Mael's, Luna's, Ciel's arguments simply don't convince me. They don't convince me that their fight is rightful. They fail to assert their belonging to a word that is, in every meaningful sense, a real word, a word trying to claim its right to exist. Everything they say ends up sounding more like a selfish desire than a meaningful counter-argument. It never really stands up to Renoir's position while he remains, sadly, completely unshaken. There are still interesting lines here, of course, but the problem is that Alicia keeps repeating that the painting means a lot to her family, to her mother, but honestly is a shitty argument, and if that were the whole story, I would fully side with Renoir. It's, let's say, obvious that continuing to live inside a dream while destroying yourself and abandoning your real life is the wrong choice, but that's not the point. It isn't that simple. This isn't just the Sand family's problem, or rather, it is, but precisely because we're talking about a family of gods, the issue becomes far more complicated. And for those who want to counter with the argument that the canvas is fake, it's a false word, people should leave it behind, hold on for a second, I've got something for you too. Renoir is the real villain here, even though he isn't actually a villain. He's the only character who truly understands the weight of erasing the canvas. He understands exactly what is being lost. He simply believes it must be done to save the Sand family, something that others don't seem to grasp. It's as if there's a disconnection between what the secondary characters experience and what the main cast experience. As if they have silently accepted that they live in a fake world rather than trying to defend their right to live, the right of Lumiere itself to exist. Still, after the fight, when Renoir allows Alicia to stay and chooses to believe in his daughter, perhaps knowing deep down that he is losing her forever, something changes. For a brief moment there is a genuine empathy for this world. There is hope not only that Alicia might find peace, but also that Lumiere itself might one day flourish again. But again, Mael is not Aline, she doesn't have the same power, she lives in completely different circumstances and her relationship with the canvas is fundamentally different as well. It's not immediately obvious, but Mael needs to remain inside the painting, and her reasons go far beyond simply being attached to a lost brother. But that's something I'll come back to later. To sum it up, the critique is based on the fact that the script brings up multiple themes and ethical questions tied to a painted world, but then fails to give them the value they deserve. I'm not saying the cutscenes should have been more dialectic or turned into a philosophical breakdown of those ideas. They just needed to make those intentions clearer through the characters' expressions and beliefs, while still keeping the emotional style that defines the work. And to be fair, that does happen, I just think it's handled in a rather underdeveloped way. The characters try in their own way to show that they care and to make us empathize with Lumiere, but honestly, they do it in a way that is not all that interesting. And it is by far the part of the story to which I was most emotionally detached. Another thing that, in my opinion, makes this feeling worse is the game's big reveal. The shift from Act 2 to Act 3 also marks a change in the story's focus, which naturally starts centering on everything that has been revealed. The narrative embraces a new drama and leaves the old one behind. And pay attention, this is a very interesting stylistic choice and it fits perfectly with the classic jaw-dropping reveal setup, but at the same time it puts itself in a very difficult position. Sure, there are stories that are based on making the player's certainties irrelevant, in which it's the core of the message they want to convey, but I don't think this is one of those cases. It is almost inevitable that, with a reveal like this, other elements like the ones tied to the painted world end up pushed into the background. That is why the script should have worked even harder to avoid making either the player's experience or the secondary character's experience feel trivial, and yet, in many moments, Act 3 does the exact opposite. It risks sending the message, or at least the feeling, that everything experienced inside the canvas is fake and has little meaning. And I don't think this was the author's intention, especially since Lumiere's drama is still what takes up the biggest part of the gameplay. So I invite you to think about this while keeping in mind the name of the Act 3 world map soundtrack. If we want to expand the discussion even further and analyze every aspect, then we finally need to talk about the Matrix paradox. A paradox that in reality is not all that complicated, but is very interesting to engage with and discuss. Put simply, the so-called simulation hypothesis is the idea that all of reality, including Earth and the universe itself, is the result of an artificial creation, the reproduction of a higher level reality that we can think of as the original one. The point of the paradox is that it's impossible to prove that your own reality, the one you experience firsthand, is actually the real one. Because if there exists something capable of recreating an alternative reality where the consciousness of the people created inside it is real and where everything is indistinguishable from true reality, then there is no way to prove that the reality in which that sub-reality was created is itself the original one, and so on infinitely. Coming back to Expedition, considering that we are talking about powers capable of painting worlds, of creating entire alternative realities inhabited by conscious people living their own lives, then we fall perfectly within this paradox. Because if it is true that Lumiere is a universe created by someone else, a painted universe in other words, the fact that it was created does not prove that it is false, or more precisely, does not justify the need to destroy it simply because it is constructed. The idea that people need to leave the canvas and start living for real again, instead of retreating into dreams, is only a partial perspective. It only applies to those who live on the higher plane of existence, because that's the thing, we're not talking about dreams. The people who are born and live in Lumiere know nothing but that reality. There is no reality that is more real than their own. And so I ask you, is it right, in order to save Alicia's life, to destroy an entire world full of lives that are quite possibly just as important as hers? Couldn't the opposite also be true? That in order to save an entire universe, one has to accept the suffering of a single person? I don't think I have an answer to that. And with everything I've said up to this point, I don't want to trivialize the need to destroy the canvas, because the tragedy of the Desandre family is real, and from the game's perspective it is absolutely right to emphasize Aline's pain in order to build that emotional connection and to introduce everything the story wants to say about family. Aline needs to leave the painting. Renoir needs to put an end to this world in order to save his family. All I'm saying is that the choice between staying in the canvas or destroying it is not black and white. There isn't a right answer and a wrong answer. It's debatable, and it should be debatable. Going back to the weaker aspects of the game, I also want to talk about how the supporting cast was handled throughout Act 3. Because aside from a few isolated moments, I think Lune, Ciel, Monaco and Esquier play an extremely marginal role in the narrative of the final act. Across all the major cutscenes they have very little depth, and their contribution to the different scenes ends up feeling extremely functional and honestly not particularly inspired. Sure, there are some interesting moments, especially during the side quests, but if we stay on the main path and look only at the cutscenes that lead us towards the endings, the added value these characters bring is very limited. And there are several reasons why this happens. First of all, it's their arguments and the way they engage with the central conflict that make them feel so forgettable, as I already mentioned in the previous sections. In that sense, the overall mood Act 3 gave me felt much flatter, much more Clair Obscur, much more black and white than what came before the reveal. I'm referring in particular to the party resurrection scene, which for me is probably the weakest sequence in the entire game. The huge reveal that explains Mael's true nature and the true nature of the world itself, a cutscene that is masterful in so many ways and probably the highest point of the entire narrative, is immediately followed by, well, a very basic reunion scene where people who have literally died and come back to life barely have any meaningful reaction. The idea of living inside a painted world, of discovering that someone else is responsible for your existence and allowed you to exist in the first place, is barely touched by the supporting characters. They hardly react to the fact that Mael not only literally brought them back from the dead, but is also capable of painting life itself into existence. Given the pacing and the focus of the later cutscenes of the third act, this was exactly the moment where the game should have leaned harder into the companion's characterization. Instead, all of those ideas are pushed aside by a sequence that ultimately closes with what I think is an incredibly unfortunate line from Esquier, who, when asked for an explanation in a conversation that already feels rather uncanny, basically responds with,
So cool, right?
From an exposition standpoint and beyond that specific cutscene, the supporting cast tell us very little about how they process this existential crisis, even through the camp conversations. Though, to be fair, the secondary quest storylines do help recover some of the ground lost by the main narrative. And to give credit where credit is due, there is one exception that I really like. The awareness that your lives amount to almost nothing in the hands of someone else comes through very clearly during Verso's ending. There is an extremely cathartic moment where Luna sits down and stares at him, almost as if she wants to accuse him of the fact that, because of his selfishness, he is literally condemning not only her but the entire population of Lumiere. And of course, she is also accusing him of lying to her once again. But overall, I wasn't particularly impressed by the way the supporting cast was handled during the final section of the game. There are some good choices when it comes to the side content, but also not really interesting choices for the main quest. What I truly love about Expedition storytelling is the way it presents a conflict that, objectively, cannot be resolved. The player's journey alongside the protagonist takes us from Gustave's death to Aline's liberation and finally to Renoir's defeat in a chain of catastrophic events, battles and victories that, despite everything, never lead to a genuinely positive resolution. And that's where the genius lies. Whether Mael wins or Renoir wins, nobody truly comes out on top. Nobody is really the villain. And be careful here, not because you can empathize with one side or the other and therefore justify the actions of the supposed antagonists. The point is that both the heroes and villains are right, and they are right in ways that don't overlap. The conflict then comes from the fact that these two realities are incompatible on a practical level, but not necessarily on a philosophical one. There is no clash of ideologies, there are only raw, unavoidable needs that have to be confronted. It is right to preserve Lumiere and not to erase the lives of hundreds of people, but it is also right for the Descendre family to finally find peace after the chain of events that shattered their lives. And here too there is an interesting philosophical discussion to be had, one that stems directly from the clash between the small picture and the big picture. Can love on a small scale, the love experienced by Renoir and the rest of the family, justify suffering on a much larger scale? Obviously, the feelings that bind the villain to his loved ones hit us directly because those people are the true protagonists of the story. But it does not automatically follow that we should agree with his position. In the end, it is a conflict very similar to the one at the heart of The Last of Us. There, too, there is never a truly good side and a truly evil one.
Unpaint me. Unpaint me.
Stop.
I don't want this life.
Stop saying that.
don't want this.
One theme to which I only became attached after finishing the game concerns an aspect that is very closely tied to the protagonist. We've already touched on the fact that Maëlle's reasons for not wanting to let go of Lumière go far beyond her attachment to Verso's memory. Within those reasons lies the theme of disability, which the game handles with a great deal of care. It is present for only a few moments, but they are powerful ones. So what's the point? Well, Alicia is not just a girl who suffered a psychological trauma and has to live with the knowledge that she was responsible for her brother's death. She also suffered a severe physical injury. The game never states it explicitly, but her suffering is impossible to ignore. She is unable to speak, and even the smallest effort seems to cause intense pain in her throat. Not to mention the fact that her face has been completely disfigured. And once you look at it from that perspective, Maëlle's attachment to Lumière becomes much more easier to understand. It's not just about having literally lived another life in another world. It is not just about giving up a universe where she has built meaningful relationships and become a true citizen of that world. It is also, and perhaps above all, about having the chance to live again. Honestly, it was only when I arrived at this realization that I fully understood how complex Maëlle is as a character. Alicia, through Maëlle, or rather Alicia as Maëlle, has the chance to speak again. She has the chance to inhabit a body that is no longer scarred by the fire. She has the chance to move beyond her disability and reclaim a life that she will most likely never be able to have outside the canvas. The protagonist's tragedy is so much bigger than it initially appears. And Painted Alicia becomes the ultimate expression of that idea. The only thing we ever really know about her is suffering. We see her desire to know Maëlle, we see the love she feels for her family, and all the while she knows that in the end she is like Verso. If anything, she is even worse. And I want you to stop for a moment and think about the cruelty of painting an immortal girl in the image of a disabled person, of giving her the suffering of someone whose face has been disfigured and who has to carry all the pain that comes with that. The real Alicia has already found a new existence, something that Aline denied to her painted counterpart. There is almost a layer of perversity in the way the mother chooses to paint her daughter, a choice that may very well stem from the resentment Aline carries towards Alicia, the person she sees as responsible for Verso's death.
She blames us, doesn't she?
Viewed through this lens, Maëlle's secondary quest takes on a much deeper and more complex meaning. Although, admittedly, I would probably have liked to see a little more of this internal conflict. The path chosen by the writers was clearly to avoid hammering on this point, and I think that was a good decision. There is a great deal of delicacy in the way this dilemma is concealed beneath the surface. After all, it is a feeling that Maëlle herself would probably be ashamed of, because it is in many ways a selfish desire. One of the moments where I think this idea shines the brightest is in her final conversation with Verso. That said, I still don't think the script presents Maëlle's desire to remain in the painted world as something positive, but that's a choice I can accept. And regardless of where the narrative itself ultimately lands on the issue, I can only praise the work these writers have done, because they managed to portray a drama that is really complex, interesting and layered.
My life of loneliness in a shell of a body, with no voice and no future.
You're Maëlle, no matter where you are. You don't need this canvas.
But everything I want is here. Here I have a chance to live, Verso, to live. Up there I merely exist.
Life keeps forcing cruel choices.
Stop quoting Papa!
Perfect, I have nothing else to say about the game, or rather I don't want to say anything else because otherwise I would never stop talking. Expedition will remain in history as one of the most important work both for me and for the video game medium, with an insane impact on the creative and production side of the industry. An impact that is not entirely dependent on the game's quality alone, but also tied to other factors. Without wanting to accuse the game of anything, since frankly it is incredibly good at what it does. But maybe not at absolutely everything.